Almighty Father in heaven, in the name of your Son, our glorious and victorious Savior, Jesus Christ, we humbly ask for your blessing upon our worship of you on this, your holy and sanctified Sabbath day, so that we may grow more in our knowledge of you, our love for you, and our obedience to you. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. For he hath founded it upon the seas, and established it upon the floods. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? Or who shall stand in his holy place? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive the blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Amen. History and Prophecy in the News for the week of January 24 to 30. January 24, 41 AD, the accession of Claudius, the fourth Roman emperor. He reigned 41 to 54 AD. He was, of course, not reigning at the time of Christ. During Jesus of Nazareth's human lifetime, there were two emperors, Augustus, who reigned about the first half of the Messiah's lifetime, and then Tiberius, who reigned up to and slightly beyond the crucifixion of Christ. I will put the link on for the study of New Testament Roman emperors. Some are more famous than others. Augustus, of course, he's mentioned directly in the Bible as the one who wrote or decreed that a census was to be held, which caused Joseph and Mary to return to Bethlehem, at which time the Messiah was born, to fulfill prophecy. But there were others as well, not mentioned specifically by name. Nero, some of the greatest persecutions of Jews, both non-believing and believing Jews, it didn't really matter to him, occurred during Nero's reign. And later on, the others, I will put the links on for the studies, as we said. Claudius was sort of in between. He was a reluctant sort of emperor, almost comical in how he was chosen, but he was. January 24, 1742, Charles Albert, the Elector of Bavaria, was chosen as Holy Roman Emperor in succession to Charles VI. As Charles VII, he was elected to oppose the Habsburg Francis, husband of Maria Theresa. Now, the connection there, two important points. Number one is that the Holy Roman Empire was German. It was simply took the name of the Holy Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire, primarily because they couldn't really get rid of the Church of Rome, and they realized for their own purposes its value to them, the political power, the political value to them, so they kept it. But the capital moved from Italy up into Germany, and it was there for centuries, and it never stopped being there. That's why the term Holy Roman Empire, actually the full name, the translated name, was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. That is what it was officially known. And the Habsburgs were some of those Holy Roman Emperors. We mentioned last week in our sermon about the First World War, it was triggered by the assassination of the Habsburg heir. And as his family were some of those so-called Holy Roman Emperors. So you can see there the biblical connection to that. Because at the very end, at the very day in which Christ is going to become the king of this world upon his return, he is going to put down the final revival of that so-called Holy Roman Empire, led by a German, yet in cahoots with the Church of Rome, those two together, and they are going to burn, the last two. We don't know about the rest, all those that came before that fulfilled that office, but we do know for certain, according to the Scriptures, that the last two are going to burn. Revelation 19:20. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. So you can see there the biblical connection to those things. It never really ends. History is sort of like, I've come to think of it sort of like a number of mirrors. You can set a mirror really close and take another one and set it farther back a little ways, another one farther back than that, and farther back than that, all pointing in the same direction. So you see the present, and you can see all these images of the present based upon those images in those mirrors, those reflections of those successively more distant things. And it's really part of it's a good analogy because you can see not quite as much in as much detail in those farther away, but you can see that they just as much reflect the present as they do or did reflect their own time. And in fact, those farther back are sort of like farther back in time because the speed of light is measurable. It's like looking at the stars at night. You only see them as they looked when that light image left, not as they are at this moment. And, reflections in a mirror are the same thing. The difference is no clock could measure something when it's that close, but technically the farther back mirrors are an older reflection of what you're looking at. So even that is a prime object lesson, literally an object lesson in how history works and the reflections that really make up the past and the present. It's the same thing, even though they're farther back. So it's just a matter like a river. You can compare it to a river of time. We've done that as well. But it all flows toward this coming point in which the world is what we know, as we know it, is going to end. The end of the world. It doesn't mean the end of the planet, but it just means the end of that river of time, a river of humanness, human ways, is going to come to an end. And only Christ has the power to do it. Only He has the power to come to this earth and straighten things out. Because right now, things are just all twisted, turned around, upside down. Satan has done a really good job in making a mess. And the greatest irony and the greatest tragedy is that some of the most anti-Christian people there are on earth are the very ones who claim to be Christian. It's true, because you look at what passes itself off as Christianity. It's directly, at times, you couldn't have a more diametrically opposing belief than what people believe Christ said, but if you actually read it, it's just not there. And boy, do they ever get mad when you tell them, when they hear it. They just can't stand it. It's just amazing how it started, I think, in December. We're just receiving a lot of hostile stuff in response to sermons and studies. And it started about, I think, around the first week of December, and it's just been increasing since then. And really the only way that I know how to respond to it, I don't bother responding to hostile emails. It doesn't do any good. It just gets you more hostile emails. But the only way I've found to respond to it is whatever made them mad, I just do it again. And again, and again, and again. Whether it be in a sermon and a study. Because it's the truth. And hopefully, if they can just crack that hard walnut shell, if this is their time, most Christians don't go easy. The Apostle Paul, he didn't go easy. He was a hard nut to crack, and eventually he was. The Lord had to do him. But sometimes people, what's going to crack that nut is anger within that person. They build up the pressure, and they're just forced in their effort to prove something wrong. They discover that it was right, and I think that's happening because usually the angriest ones stop after a little bit. If you just force them to look at what they really believe and prove it, and if now's their time, if the Holy Spirit's there, it's going to be their time. So ultimately, it's doing them some good. But in the meantime, they just have their fits and frenzies, and that's too bad. But there's nothing new about that either. It's just the same old thing. I mentioned before one of the responses was that how if Christ were to preach a sermon just exactly the same as is recorded in the Bible for everyone to read, if he were to go into a mainstream Christian church today and preach it, they would probably throw him out. Perhaps beat him to death in the parking lot. I said that one. It's true. And the reason I say that is simply because that's what they did in his own time. The reason he left Nazareth is because they were going to kill him for what he said in a sermon when he stood up to read in the synagogue. And if you think it was just Christ rejecting Jews of that time that did that, well, there's just as many Christ rejecting Christians today would do the very same thing. There's no difference. And there's nothing you can do about it till that time comes, when Christ is going to sort them out. The sheep from the goats, that's coming. The ones that are just so stubborn that they just resist the Holy Spirit. And that's the blasphemy and the unpardonable sin. We'll thank God for that. So it's a tangled up mess, but it's so clear, really. And the reason we have to have compassion on people like that is because we were those people at one time. Do you remember that? Do you remember when you were just as hostile to the truth, while at the same time thinking you're a very good Christian? It happens. And it's the way you got to... When somebody throws a fit, an anger fit at you because you preach the truth, the only thing you can do to respond is preach the truth even more. And more, and more, and more. You just keep doing it, and that's the way we do it. Of course, it produces more anger, but again, hopefully the nut will crack, and they'll learn to be nice to themselves. Because, anger at the truth, you're not hurting anybody but yourself. Because if the Holy Spirit's there, you're in the danger zone. You really are. Because it's getting close to the unpardonable sin, if now's your time. We'll put the link on for that study as well. January 25, 1533, defying Rome, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, his second wife. Henry, of course, wanted a divorce. The Pope said no. So Henry just went ahead and did whatever he wanted, and the result was the Church of England. And to this day, just as Henry had done, he appointed himself king and head of the church. That broke Britain away from the papacy. Good came of it, but really Henry's motives were really very much his own. He had no grand scheme or grand plan of religious liberty or anything else. He just wanted to get married again, and then once he was able to do that and have his own blessing for divorces and remarriage, he kept going. He did it over and over and over again. January 28, 1807, London's Pall Mall, which is an abbreviation of parallel to the mall, became the first street to be illuminated by gaslight. So in the technology, consider that, how cities were once very dark places. It certainly would have been an astronomer's paradise. People back then could certainly see the stars far more than, although in Britain they tend to have a lot of overcast, but nevertheless it would have, on clear nights they would have been able to see things that certainly people all around the world could not see now. The amount of lighting that is involved. Where I live, I have a telescope. I can see toward the west, city Woodstock. Toward the north, I can see Paris, which is just a small town, but beyond that is Kitchener, Waterloo, that area up in there, the sky glow. Toward the east of me is Brantford. I can see the sky glow there. Stars in that area are not seen at all, and back then, toward the south, I don't have anything, just Burford. Burford's only about 1,200 people. We don't have a lot of sky glow in Burford, but nevertheless, there's a lot of, even in our own areas, there's an industrial mall about a mile away from where I live. The security lighting there. There's the freeway, all the lights from that, about 3/4 of a mile in the other direction. It's just something that we in our modern day world sort of lost connection with, because back then people could really see the stars, see what's up there, the heavens. Perhaps that's enabled them to be a little more in closer with nature at the very least. Unfortunately, some of them sort of became worshippers of it, but they nevertheless had a closer connection to the creation, and perhaps a greater appreciation of the Creator. January 28, 1980, 6 Americans were smuggled out of Tehran, Iran, in what became known as the Canadian Caper. The Americans hid in the Canadian Embassy for over 2 months after the U.S. Embassy had been taken over by Iranian militants. The 6 escaped Iran by using Canadian passports. Ambassador Ken Taylor left a few hours later after closing the embassy. And there is the sort of the joke. The reason it took 2 months to get the Americans out of there is because it took them that long to learn how to speak Canadian, because there is sort of a Canadian accent in a way. We do mangle the English language in our own special kind of way. It was actually a necessary part, because there you had to pass customs to get out of the country, just as much as passing customs to get in, and they could spot the accent differences primarily. So they really had to do that, and it certainly didn't take 2 months to do it, but of course they were just waiting for the right time, or perhaps waiting for the hostage situation to end, and of course it didn't. It went on for 444 days, on and on and on. And of course after the Americans were smuggled out, we shut the embassy as well. Ambassador Taylor, I think one Canadian military man, were the last 2 out, and they closed it down because they knew the story was going to break. Apparently a newspaper somewhere, I forget where it was, whether it was in Canada or in the U.S., he did a count. This reporter, he was really doing his job. He did a count of the number of the staff. Apparently he found a staff listing or something of people who were at the embassy, and he did a count of the number of Americans and compared that to the number who were captured, and he came up short by 6 or 7. And he knew that there was something going on, and he actually called some of the Western embassies to find out what was going on, and apparently he sort of deduced that there were Americans hiding in one of them. He didn't know which one, and he sat on that story. He didn't break it, which was good, because it would have been far more of a problem than it turned out to be. So journalism, is a good thing, freedom of the press, but there's also a responsibility as well to sometimes sit on things in order to protect lives. January 29, 1613, Galileo observed Neptune, quote unquote, but didn't recognize that he was looking at a planet. And of course, if you ever seen Galileo's telescope, the first one had a lens diameter of 1 inch. 1 inch. It was just a tiny little thing. I think its magnification power was 3. It was practically not much more than an eyeball. Practically not much more. But he was able to see those things. And again, it's amazing. So many planets, stars, constellations, scientific discoveries, space exploration programs have been named after pagan things. In this example, Neptune. But look at all the things that have been given the names of pagan gods, and yet it was by scientists who claimed to reject the foolishness of religion, quote unquote, and yet they use these pagan names for everything. It's like, I don't know why they do that. It seems contradictory at the very least why they do that. January 29, 1916, the first bombings of Paris by German Zeppelins took place. And same day, January 29, 1916, British military tanks were tested for the first time. So the First World War, although crude, it was sort of a turning point in the technology, because you see the beginning of bombardment by air, the use of tanks, and so on. Rockets were just beginning to be used. Some people say the Chinese invented those as fireworks displays. But you can see the world wars, as we mentioned in our sermon last week, covered in our sermon last week, how it sort of brought about the world as it is. And so much of what had to be was sort of settled by those two wars. And though they sort of paved the way for the world as it's going to be on the day of Christ's return, in which there aren't going to be any more wars. There will be no more wars. Period. There's going to be peace. Finally. And isn't that going to be a wonderful world? It truly will be paradise. People think that the kingdom of God is here now because they call the churches of this world the kingdom of God. Well, it's not a very nice kingdom. I mean, look at what's going on in the world. That's not the kingdom of God. And as we said, most Christian professing people reject the words of Christ. But they won't then. By means of his power, of influence, just the example that when Christ is here on earth, reigning, people will be able to look, and there will be no power matching him or competing with him. So it won't be a matter of conflicting influence. Satan is going to be put away. That will be gone. And the power as well for those who wish to reject salvation for themselves, well, that power will be there as well. But it's going to be a very different world, because people will be able to see with their own two eyes clearly, in their mind's eye as well, because Satan won't be there. The evidence that it was all true. Just consider some of the most famous verses of the Bible, how that day the entire world is going to look to Christ and actually be able to see him and realize it's a better way for themselves. They're going to realize it's all about salvation for themselves. All they need to do is accept it. Micah 4:1-4, but in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among many people, and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Thy kingdom come. This is a quote from the book Jerusalem in the 20th Century by Martin Gilbert. Quote, on 30 October 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice, ending in defeat and ignominy the hostilities it had begun with such confidence 4 years earlier. For the Jews of Jerusalem, with the Balfour Declaration having promised them a national home in Palestine, it seemed that a bright future was in prospect under the benign eye of the British military authorities. Amid great enthusiasm, as the war in Europe clearly looked as though it would be soon ended, the Zionists in Jerusalem celebrated the first anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. That day, November 2, a training school for Jewish nurses, financed by the Hadassah Women's Organization in the United States, was dedicated, and the first student nurses were enrolled. That same day, the Zionist Commission held a parade in the city. In the evening, there was dancing and singing. End of quote. Now, you will note there that that is a very significant time for the return of the people of Judah to their homeland, a very important part of the later establishment of them as a sovereign nation, okay? And it was all made possible, as we just read, by the end of the Ottoman Empire. So you see why the Ottoman Empire was in the way of the return of the people of Judah, and therefore in the way of end-time prophecies that we read of, many that are directly related to what is going to be happening in Jerusalem, things that only the people of Judah could have brought about, and the world's response to that, Europe's response primarily, because at that time the last great superpower of the world will be that last revival of the Holy Roman Empire, as we've covered in so many other sermons and studies. But you can see plainly there how the Ottoman Empire had to go. And can you think of what the Ottoman Empire is? It's something that lasted for centuries, but most of us never learned much about it in school. It's not something that people who read the Bible think of, although the nation that created the Ottoman Empire is very well known in the scriptures, Turkey, because Turkey was practically where much of the Bible began in terms of the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. Many of the letters and things are written to people in Turkey. The book of Revelation is written to the 7 churches of Asia, which in that case meant Turkey. Those 7 churches were in western Turkey. The island of Patmos is off the coast of Turkey. So you can see there, it's there, but Turkey went on to become a great empire. And then, when it was done that, Turkey again today exists as a regular nation. So it's an important part of understanding Bible history and a Bible prophecy, to understand who the Ottomans were. And that's the reason we're doing this today, this sermon. But first, in order to understand who the Ottomans were, you have to understand Turkey, because they have a history that goes back farther than, obviously much farther than we here in North America. Our nations are like 200 or 300, 400 years, and that's it. That's our history. Whereas Turkey and the European nations and the Asian nations have been there far much longer. So first, let's understand a little history of Turkey in order to understand how the Ottoman Empire came about. First, Turkey. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Turkey is a republic of southeastern Europe and Asia Minor, bounded by the Black Sea to the north, by Iran and the Soviet Union to the east, by Iraq and Syria to the south, and by Greece and Bulgaria to the west. Turkey in Europe is separated from Turkey in Asia, or Anatolia, by the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles, which link the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. End of quote. And that in itself shows just how Turkey was bound to be a major player in Middle Eastern history, in Bible history, because it was the place in which the great empires crossed. It was the place where, for all intents and purposes, the new and growing Church of God began, because much of the New Testament was written or about the Apostle Paul, and he was born in technically what is today Turkey, up in Tarsus. We'll put the link on for that study. And it was there that he began his missionary journeys, this first one. He then was apparently intending to remain in that area and but the Lord directed him toward Europe. And as we just read here, that is where he went, because it's the connection that is there. Put the links on for those 3 studies. And many of the letters that were written, the very famous 7 churches of Asia, as described in the book of Revelation, are in Turkey. Many of the things that occurred regard to prophecy as well. The island of Patmos is just off the mainland of Turkey. It is something that people knew and were aware of and were from, and the connection to the Bible history as we read it, the amount that we have and the time frame that we have up to the end of the 1st century, is direct, because Turkey was subject to the great empires of Bible history, primarily because it was in between Europe and Asia, or part of Europe and Asia in itself, sometimes called Asia Minor, because of the southern area in which it was confined primarily by water. The seas that are in there, we'll put the links on for the maps there. But it was bound to be a part of Bible history up to the end of the recorded New Testament era, apart from prophecy. So it was bound to be there. It was itself occupied a number of times by the empires that either were moving east or west, the European ones in Rome or Greece, the Asian ones, Persia, Syria, Babylon. They all had at least part of Turkey, sometimes all of it in itself. So Turkey has known a lot of occupiers. It's known a lot of people who were foreign to them, and yet they maintained themselves throughout all that time. And like so many other cases, eventually they became a great empire in themselves. Later on, beyond the time of Bible history as recorded in up to the end of the 1st century, as we have in our Bibles. And they're holding a vast area in themselves, including the land of Israel, which they held for centuries, literally centuries. But the Christian connection to what is today Turkey is very strong. We read of it throughout the New Testament. Paul, as he said, was from Turkey. At the time, it was Roman occupied. It was in effect a Roman province, and it was from that Paul was able to claim legal Roman citizenship. And the irony of that as well, eventually they killed him, and of course they were the great persecutors of Christians. But as the legal rights that Paul had enabled him to travel as a Roman citizen, protected by Roman troops, Roman garrisons all along the way, the road, that it would have enabled him, if he wanted to travel all the way to Britain. He spoke of traveling perhaps to Spain. He could have done it by ship, but he could have also walked or used some other animal means of transportation. Because if you look at the map of the Roman Empire, we'll put the link on for that, at the time that Roman troops were occupying the land of Israel, they were also occupying Britain and all the lands in between. Primarily southern Europe. They didn't take Germany, but they took practically everything else up in through there. So Paul was himself a Turk who was enabled to travel at that time. He called himself a Jew and a Benjamite both, and that's been confusing. It's one of those things where people take something that, for example, Paul, he's often quoted because he wrote so much of the New Testament, or so much of it is about him. But he was someone who had a worldview, while at the same time really recognizing only the Roman world. We'll put the link on for that study as well. When he spoke of the whole world, he was talking about the Roman world. It's all that really mattered. And part of what was his upbringing was that political awareness of his legal rights, because when he was caught or arrested as a troublemaker, when in fact all he was doing was preaching the truth and unbelievers tried to get him killed, when he was arrested, he immediately claimed his rights as a Roman citizen. So he was well aware of what that meant to him, while at the same time recognizing that he was a Jew and a Benjamite, both. I'll put the link on for that study, why Paul claimed to be both. But he also claimed to be a Roman citizen. Put the link on for that other study as well. But he was technically, if he were born today, he'd be a Turk. A Jew and a Turk. And the interestingness of that, so many people think of the Church of God as though it were just, if you're living in the Western nations, somehow it's our church, it just belongs to us, in the sort of Eurocentric ideas that have been transferred to North America, North and South America, because oftentimes you will see pictures, so-called pictures of Jesus, looking exactly like the very sort of person that was the artist. Northern European artists showed Christ as a light brown-haired, blue-eyed Northern European, when in fact he certainly was not that. And Paul certainly himself wasn't either. He was rather very typical of his own appearance, of his own time, and so on. So it's really, we're the foreigners when it comes to actually where the church was born. And the birthday of the church, we put out a study about that recently, just who those people were. They were from all those other nations of the world, but they were Jews from all those other nations of the world. They had been scattered, and they came to Jerusalem, and they were so much a part of their new nations, just as Paul was, as we said, because when he got into trouble, he immediately claimed his Roman citizenship. But all those other people, their native languages of speaking in tongues, those were Jews who were born somewhere, native-born citizens of other countries all over the place, and they were the ones that heard those speaking in tongues. They were all Jews. They weren't people, Gentiles from other nations. That came later. When Peter addressed them, he addressed them as Jews because that's what they were. They also happened to be believing Jews who became the first Christians. And it was Paul, ironically, Paul the Turk, Paul the Jewish Turk, who took the gospel first to his own homeland. The first journey primarily he left with Barnabas, who was from Cyprus, and they went through Cyprus first, and then they went across by sea up into Turkey. And both of them went to their own hometowns for all intents and purposes, and literally as well, but they crossed their own hometowns. But it was Paul that was the taker of, not the maker of the gospel, but the taker of the gospel, first to his own homeland, and then cross into Europe, because he was the one that brought the birthday of the church, if you will, to those Gentile people. Because what we read in the first chapter of Acts was the birthday of the church among the Jewish believers. I'll put the link on for that study. But it was a matter of Turkey. That's really where the heart of it began. Much of prophecy was there. If you look at some of the very famous 7 churches of Asia, some of the most prophetic prophecies as well, some have used those prophetic churches as sort of a succession of churches throughout history, and sort of the Philadelphia church and all that are supposed to be the really good one. The Laodicean, well, that's just the lukewarm one. I think the Worldwide Church of God was very big on that particular doctrine. But if you look at the descriptions of those people, and keeping in mind those were churches that existed at the very same time in Turkey in the first century, the characteristics of them can be found anywhere in any group of people. Perhaps one particular trait was more prevalent in one church or another, and perhaps they were used in that way, but there's no such thing as that a trait that would go on for centuries without everything else, all the other sorts of traits there. There have been lukewarm people from day one, and there have been very good people in terms of their devotion and to the obedience and the truth from day one, and everything else in between, and so on. It just goes on and on from that. So there are good people and bad people. There's nothing successive about human nature, or the nature that humans have taken on after Satan's influence got hold of them, infected them, if you will. But Turkey became the hometown, the home basis of a lot of the early Christian church, while at the same time it was under occupation. Because it too, as we said, the land of Israel was under occupation, Britain was under occupation, all of southern Europe was, and so was Turkey at that time. It had been reduced to a Roman province, little more, not a nation in itself. Although the nation, again, you have to keep in mind the definition of what nation is. It means nativity, where you're born. That's what nation means. Nation and country don't mean the same thing. You can have one country, but many nations within it, as in people, their nativity, their race, if you will, and so on. In Paul's case, well, he knew who he was. He was of the tribe of Judah, religiously, politically, but he was also a Benjamite. That was his actual forefather, through Benjamin. We'll put the link on for that, how that connection can be there. So it's interesting to understand how things can change, because keeping in mind that humble beginning, if you will. Turkey existed before that time, but I'm talking about the early Christian church. What it became later on is almost a direct contradiction, because it became an empire in itself. And how often, over and over and over throughout history, that happens. the repetition. It's like the same script, but different people fulfill the roles. And sometimes someone who was just an understudy in the last act turns out to be the star in this one for a while, and then they end up may well be the understudy in the next act. It goes around and around like that, because Turkey went from an occupied nation, and keeping in mind this was back in the time of the 1st century, it then became an empire, as we'll examine today as well, and the biblical connection to that, and when it ended. But then it returned from that to a regular nation again, because Turkey's still there. It's still very much there. I heard some time back from a Christian in Turkey, and the irony of that, I don't know if he realized it or not, I assume he did, because when he's reading about the Bible, when he reads his Bible, he's reading about the very lands, much of it, of the New Testament, he's reading about the very land in which he lives. The irony of that. As this particular man had formerly been a Muslim, he adopted Christianity. He came to the truth. It seemed to be his time of calling, because he was a Sabbath keeper. He understood much of what the Bible said. But the irony for him, he was living right there. He could literally go to today those 7 churches of Revelation. He could go to them and see them, although they're in ruin state, most of them. He could go to the birthplace of Paul, Tarsus, all those cities up in there, and it's his homeland. So the connection is there. You see how ancient, how something can be so ancient and yet still be modern. It's like it doesn't really matter when it happens, because it's like those mirrors set at different distances. They're all reflecting the present. If you use yourself as an example of the present, it can be reflecting anything. So let's have a look today at what Turkey became. When it took its turn as an empire, it became known as the Ottoman Empire, and how it occupied the land of Israel right up until the end of the First World War. It was the king of that area, literally the ruler of that area for centuries. The Ottoman Empire. Let's have a look. I'll just use a brief quote from the Columbia Viking Desk Encyclopedia. And the reason I quote encyclopedias or other references, just to emphasize the fact that what we're teaching here is based on factual history. It isn't just our opinion. We have secular history to back up what we're saying, because the point of this is that secular history is, in fact, a part of prophecy as it moves along. This is from a brief quote. Columbia Viking Desk, it's very brief, very concise. The Columbia Viking Desk Encyclopedia, very brief, very concise, very much to the point. It's the way we try to write our studies, as you may have noticed. We try to break them down into single points and emphasize to get that point across just as clearly as we can, using as few words, because oftentimes if you want to be clear, say as little as you can, because the more words things get, again, the information glut analogy as we described, how sometimes what you're trying to say can just be buried in a lot of stuff. So it's better to get it across, and this point, I think, does it. These articles such as this do that. Just brief. Consider just who it is, what it is, because a lot of people, have never heard of the Ottoman. Most people have heard of Turkey, but they haven't really heard of the Ottoman Empire. Or even those who have heard of Turkey don't really make the connection to the Bible. Because, again, we've become so self-centric or egocentric in our reading of the Bible, we sort of forget that, to the Bible's perspective, we're the foreigners. We're the ones on the other side of the world, not them, because, it's just the way it was. And, the kingdom of God and Zion and all that is going to be in Jerusalem. The holy place, the focus of prophecy that's going to be there. Personally, I believe the Ark of the Covenant is going to be found. And again, it's not going to require the building of a great sort of Herodian temple or anything. And, the Muslim people could probably keep their position up there. It won't require the people of Judah to get rid of it. Although, again, I think if the Ark is found, I think I mentioned last week that they occasionally find things up there, just artifacts, and literally take them to the dump. They do that. They couldn't do that if they found the Ark. The Ark is something, it's for the very reason that the Ark is where it is, because no one can do anything to it, carry it away. Even Israelites couldn't. When it's found, it's going to require specific Levites, who, by the way, are ready. People like the so-called Temple Mount Faithful, other groups, they have found the actual Levites who would be qualified to handle the ark. Those people are there, ready. And they wouldn't take it anywhere because they, as who they are, they recognize where that ark is supposed to be. What they would do, beginning first of all, would be to build probably something that would look very much like the Old Testament tabernacle in the wilderness. That is very likely what would happen, because they would need something that could be built quickly. And because, again, I think there was a scene in that in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark that people who looked inside of it, their eyes melted and they were dissolved and all that, their wrath. Well, that's not probably a whole lot far off, because that's biblical. It's described the wrath that came upon people who were unauthorized to even to touch it or get that close to it. And so it's probably probably a tabernacle. That's what's going to happen. And it's just as holy. And probably the people who are going to be driven away off the top of the Temple Mount are the very forces that will accompany the finding of the ark. It's all going to happen very quickly. Brief quote about the Ottoman Empire. I'll put the link on for the study Raiders of the Lost Ark as well. Quote, "The Ottoman Empire was the greatest of Muslim states, formed in the 14th to the 16th century in the Near East by the Ottoman or Osmanli Turks after the breakdown of the Seljuk Empire. It was also called Turkey, but modern Turkey formed only a part of it. The Ottoman state emerged and expanded under Osman I, founder of the empire's dynasty, Murad I, Bayezid I, at the expense of the Byzantine Empire." Now, to interject there, that's the other leg of the Roman Empire when it split. Continuing, by Bulgaria and Serbia. And again, to interject there, as we discussed in our sermon last week, that's where the First World War began up there. And by the way, it's interesting as well, the man who shot Pope John Paul II was a Turk. He was from that area. And interesting, the reference to Bulgaria, apparently, according to some, he was directly, his sponsors were the Bulgarian Secret Service, but which were in turn working at the behest of the Russian KGB, because he was a threat to the control over Poland. He was too popular to deal with attack directly, so they had to make it seem as though some radical shot him, but in fact I think most people realize it was the KGB who arranged for that assassination. Didn't work. There were actually, ironically, two people who brought down the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, and that was Pope John Paul II, who was influence in Poland, giving the people moral support there, the Solidarity Labor Union and so on. They had the moral support of the Pope. I mean, if you think you've got the Pope not only just sort of praying for you, but right in your corner, and they did, that's pretty good for morale, isn't it? That gives them a lot of courage, and certainly they made use of it. So Pope John Paul was one of them, and the other one was Ronald Reagan. He started a arms competition, an arms race, and a very expensive arms race that bankrupted the Soviet Union. He may well, as it turns out, may have bankrupted the United States as well, and the debt is just piling up now to the point where the interest isn't getting there. But isn't it interesting as well, both John Paul II and Ronald Reagan both survived assassination attempts. Isn't that amazing? Almost as though they had to live to do what they had to do, getting the Soviet Union out of the way. Because, if the Soviet Union weren't out of the way, the European Union would not rise. The unification of Europe was necessary for the end-time rise of that beast power again. So even the Soviet Union had to go, just like the Ottomans did here. So, the assassins of the alleged assassins, attempted assassins of President Reagan and John Paul II, they might have been successful. It was just ordinary history. They could have been. It's possible. But they both had to live. At least the result of what they had to do was necessary. So again, you can see the connection. Some people can say, well, it's just a coincidence. Well, if it is, it just works. It had to be one way or the other, and it happened. The European Union, the end time European Union, could not have come into being, will not come into being, if the Soviet Union and the Cold War were still there. And Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul, very different men, very different activities, very different approach, but they were together, brought it down. So, again, it's just something else that's in plain sight for anybody who wants to really realize what's happening. If you understand prophecy, again, the modern state of Israel, as we said, or Judah, as we're trying, the whole point of the sermon, could not have happened if not for the Ottomans being taken down. Things have to happen in order for other things to be able to happen. And they're all interconnected. After their victories at Bursa in 1326, Kosovo in 1389, and Nikopol in 1396, the Turks were only temporarily checked by Tamerlane in 1402. And just consider the dates here that we're talking about. We're roughly at a halfway point between the end of the first century, in which the biblical record of the New Testament biblical record ended, and the modern time. Continuing. In 1453, Muhammad II conquered Constantinople and became heir to the Byzantine Empire. And to inject that, of course, Constantinople was named after Constantine. It is today known as, more famously as, in Turkey, Istanbul. And again, the connection there to the Roman Empire, the division, and how the empires of the past that they've been subjected to for so long, and Bible lands also had been subjected to for so long, that was all there, still continuing. The Ottoman Empire reached its height in the 16th century under Selim I, who assumed the caliphate after his victories in Syria and Egypt in 1516-17, and under Suleiman the First, or the Magnificent, in Algiers. Most of Greece and Hungary and much of Persia and Arabia had come under Turkish rule. And that, again, that's describing practically not merely the individual ancient empires as recorded in the Bible, but all of them together. That was the vastness of it. They held a vast area just as much as those ancient empires, whether it be Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome. They did it all. They did the very same thing. Continuing, Transylvania, Wallachia, Moldavia had become tributary principalities. However, in every respect, Turkey remained a medieval state, with its Byzantine Asiatic despotic system mitigated only by observance of Muslim law. Decline began with Suleiman's death. Militarily, the first setback was the naval defeat at Lepanto in 1571. Now, continue, just to interject there, keeping in mind the Ottoman Empire did not end until the end of the First World War in 1918. And this event here was in 1571. They were around a long time, weren't they? Over 4 centuries there. But the decisive blow was the repulse of the Turkish siege of Vienna in 1683, followed in 1699 by the Treaty of Karlowitz. Political decay set in, that is, the Janissaries, made and unmade sultans. Corruption and bribery were raised to a system of administration. And again, typical of empires. The political power, the very political system that was their strength, ended up being what caused them to fall inward. It's like an implosion. You see buildings, controlled detonations, implosions, how they'll go down like that. That's really what happened there. The system becomes corrupt, weakened from within. It's like a very strong outer shell, but nothing inside holding it, the framework. Continuing. The breakup of the state was accelerated by the Russo-Turkish wars of the 18th century. After the Greek War of Independence, the fate of the sick man of Europe, quote-unquote, became a major European concern. The Western powers feared Russian expansion and loss of their investments in Turkey, which in a series of treaties called capitulations had virtually surrendered its economic independence to them. Civil reforms were attempted. Midhat Pasha framed a constitution in 1876, but the Abdul al-Hamid II soon abolished it. In 1908, the Young Turks and a reformist and nationalistic movement forced the restoration of the constitution, but the dissolution of the empire was beyond remedy. With much of its territory already lost, Most of the remaining European Turkey went in the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 13. Enver Pasha, leader of the Young Turks, assumed dictatorial powers in 1913. In the First World War, Turkey was allied with Germany. Turkish troops were successful in the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, but in 1918 all resistance collapsed, and the Treaty of Sevres confirmed the dissolution of the empire. With the overthrow of the last sultan by Ataturk in 1922, the history of modern Turkey began. So again, they went from ancient Turkey to the Ottoman Empire and back to a regular nation again. And again, that is typical of how empires did it. Egypt was a great empire. It was a regular nation. It was a great empire. It's gone back to a regular nation. Greece, Rome. Rome is an exception. Explain that. Babylon, or Assyrian Babylon, known today as Iraq, it's had a long and grand history as well. Today the country's in ruins, but they'll rise again. They always do. And Persia, well, Iran, known today as Iran, it was also a great empire. It's seeking to get power back again, but it's really never going to go much beyond its own borders. But they'll never be the great empire again. You're never going to see Iranian armies march across the Middle East in such a way that they did during the time they were an empire. You won't see it in the Turkish either. You won't see Britain do it again either. You can see how empires grow. They're born, they grow, they become strong, and for whatever reason, usually not due to military defeat, but rather some other problem, sort of like a balloon that gets blown up and it just doesn't have the structure to hold itself out. Typically, the Ottoman Empire was typical in that way. But the connection to the Bible is the point of the sermon, because at the time, up to the First World War, they controlled the land of Israel, what was known as the land of Israel. It was a Muslim land. People of Judah were not welcome there. Simply were not. They were tolerated barely, but in terms of the freedom that they had to get a foothold at the time the British took over at the end of the First World War, as the quote we read at the beginning of the sermon, how they rejoiced when the Ottomans fell and the British came in, just wasn't there. And if they hadn't done so, they would have been in no position to make, if you will, a declaration of independence in 1948. And the modern state of Israel today would not exist. And the Ottoman Empire was a connection to that. It was just one of the latest series of empires to the very end, time that permitted the people of Judah to become what they are. And the irony as well, Turkey's looking to become a member of the EU. Isn't that amazing? And how it's going to end up becoming federalized as well, but also at the very same time that Israel is as well, also seeking to become at least an associate member. Because for them it just makes sense on a business sense. I mean, Europe is right there. So you can understand how they would want to do it. But the connections are there. And again, you can look at Turkey. We use the example of mirrors facing toward you, but at different distances, all reflecting the same thing, but the closer ones with more detail visible. Turkey is a grand example of that. It went on for centuries. But at the same time, the result was the same. And again, keeping in mind that much of the Bible was written to people, or for people, who lived there at that time. And Paul himself was a Turk, politically by birth, by geographic birth. So isn't it interesting how these things the connections are all there, but if you read history in such a way that the psychology of it, why people do things, why they rise, why they invade other nations, why they do what they do, this really hasn't changed. And how it's so much of a part of the world, the state of mind that's going to exist at the time of Christ's return, because it won't be anything new. It is so typical of what we've seen throughout the Bible from the very time. Now, Israel itself was this downtrodden little nation who reached superpower status and yet collapsed inward. Not because they were defeated by virtue of the fact that they could have been defeated, but because they abandoned the structure, the foundation, the framework that enabled them to be what they were, and that was obedience to the Lord. When that was gone, they dissolved into exile. But then they came back too. The final fall came under a very famous British general, Allenby. A couple quick quotes from Jerusalem in the 20th century by Martin Gilbert. Quote, on November 7, Gaza fell to Allenby's troops. With Beersheba already under their control, the way was open for the advance on Jerusalem. And as well, next paragraph, on November 9, the advanced units of the Australian and New Zealand Mounted Division had reached to within 20 miles of Latrun, the entrance to the Jerusalem hills from the west. From the south, an attempt was being made from Beersheba to reach Jerusalem through Hebron and Bethlehem. And all very famous names, biblical names, familiar to everyone who reads the Bible. And again, at the very same time, the steamroller of history was there. The Ottomans' time was up. Another quote, that day in London, the British government made public a letter from the Foreign Secretary, A.J. Balfour, sent to Lord Rothschild a week earlier, in which Balfour promised to use Britain's influence to establish, quote, a national home in Palestine, unquote, for the Jews. Another quote, to avoid any fighting in Jerusalem itself, Allenby launched his final attack to the north of the city, intending on cutting the Jerusalem-Ramallah road and breaking the Turkish lines of communications with Nablus and German headquarters to the north. By the morning of November 21, Allenby's men were fighting the Turks on the slopes of Nebi Samuel, the traditional site of the tomb of the prophet Samuel, from which could be seen the spire of the Russian Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives and the tower forming German military headquarters at the Augusta Victoria. So you see the connection there, isn't it amazing? And again, the World Wars, how that began to be. Germany was there because of the Ottomans, because Germany regarded the Ottoman Empire, the weakening. They were in a long slide, but they were still powerful. But Germany regarded them as a sub-part or a sub-leadership or sub-ally to themselves, and they were certainly there as well. But the time was up, and they fell one after another like a domino effect. They fell to the British, and of course the British, their time was there. They lasted. They had a UN mandate after that, primarily based on the Balfour Declaration, and they remained until the 1940s and right through the Second World War, which again sort of knocked down that rising beast in Europe again. But you see the connections, all these famous biblical places, but most people have never heard of it or read of it, the British taking of it, and as well the connection there, why they held on for so long. And as soon as the British Empire was done, at the end of the Second World War, the United States stepped in to, in effect, become Britain, to fulfill the vacuum the British Empire left, and they became the sponsors of Israel from that time, as it remains to this very day. And while at the same time, ironically, Israel is looking to become a member of the EU, of all things. And again, that's part of necessary, I think, something else that has to happen in order for the beast power to be into the end time, the abomination of desolation, because a foreigner couldn't do it. A foreigner could not do it. But someone who is their own federal president, if the European Union includes within its membership Israel, then that foreign leader won't be foreign to them. It'll be their own federal president. And if the religion is state religion of Europe, which it already is, most of the constitutions of Europe, national constitutions, have Roman Catholicism as their state religion, official state religion, then it all goes together. And certainly at that time, it's all going to seem so right with the miracles and everything else. Because don't forget, the people of Judah are still waiting for a physical Messiah. They missed recognizing him the first time, many of them did. So they're still looking around on this earth rather than looking up where they should be. But the good news is he is coming. And he, Jesus Christ, is what Zionism is truly all about. We'll put the link on for that. So you see how things have to happen. How people are given a task in history. Most of the empires had a particular task. And once that's fulfilled, then they step back to become normal folks again. It's like somebody who's a leader of a country, and they retire and they just sort of go back into private life. That's really what a lot of countries have done in terms of their time as empires. But there's coming a time when there aren't going to be any more empires. There's going to be the kingdom of God, and it's going to be far better than any sort of man-made kingdom has ever been. Thy kingdom is coming, and thank God for that. Thank you for joining us for services this week. As always, your being with us makes our joy complete. Until next week, when we meet again on this, God's holy Sabbath day, may the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. God bless you all.